March 25th, 1983. Inside the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, a 24-year-old performer was about to change entertainment forever. The producers had told him no. His own lawyers tried to stop him from broadcasting it. And when he rehearsed the move just hours before showtime, even some of the biggest names in music who happened to be watching weren't quite sure what they were seeing. But in 2.5 seconds, Michael Jackson would create the most talked about moment in television history. This is the story of how a dance move that almost never happened became the moonwalk. To understand why that night at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium meant so much, you have to go back to a small house in Gary, Indiana, where a young Michael Jackson was already dreaming bigger than anyone thought possible. Berry Gordy didn't want to meet them. The founder of Motown Records had built an empire with artists like the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, and Stevie Wonder. When his assistant told him about 5 brothers from Gary, Indiana who wanted an audition, Gordy's response was clear. No more kid acts. He'd already dealt with the headaches of managing young Stevie Wonder, with all the tutors and teachers and parents and legal complications that came with child performers. But his assistant wouldn't take no for an answer. She eventually convinced Gordy to at least watch them. That morning, when 10-year-old Michael Jackson walked into the audition room with his brothers, Berry Gordy saw everything that was the word he used later. Everything. The kid moved like no child he'd ever seen. He sang with a voice that didn't match his age. And there was something else. Something harder to define. A hunger. The Jackson 5 signed with Motown in 1969, and Michael became the face of the group almost immediately. By the time he was 13, he'd had 4 #1 singles. He'd appeared on television countless times. He'd performed for thousands of people, and none of it was enough. People who worked with young Michael noticed something unusual about him. Even after shows where the crowd went wild, where people screamed and cried and reached out to touch him, Michael would go backstage and critique himself. He'd ask what he could have done better. He'd practice the same moves over and over until they were perfect, then push himself to make them even more perfect. When you grow up performing, you learn early that nothing lasts. Success can disappear as quickly as it arrives. And Michael Jackson, who'd been the cute kid everyone loved, knew that childhood wouldn't last forever. He needed to evolve. He needed to prove he wasn't just a former child star trading on nostalgia. By the time the Jackson 5 left Motown in 1975 for CBS Records, the music industry had changed. Disco was dominating the charts. Rock music was everywhere. And Michael Jackson was trying to figure out where he fit in a world that had grown up while he was busy being famous. He signed with Epic Records as a solo artist. His first album for them, Off the Wall, released in 1979, sold 10 million copies. It was a massive success by any measure. The album produced 4 top 10 singles. Critics loved it. But Michael Jackson was disappointed. It didn't win Album of the Year at the Grammys. Rolling Stone magazine wouldn't put him on their cover, telling him that black artists didn't sell magazines. Michael told friends he was tired of being told what he couldn't do, where he didn't belong, what barriers existed for artists who looked like him. And he made a promise to himself. The next album would be so good that nobody could ignore it. Every single song would be perfect. Not one throwaway track. Nothing but hits. That album was Thriller. Thriller hit stores on November 30th, 1982. By December 25th, it had entered the Billboard 200 chart at number 11. It was a strong start, but nothing that predicted what was about to happen. Michael had worked with producer Quincy Jones again, the same partnership that had created Off the Wall. But this time, they went further. They sorted through over 600 songs before settling on 9 tracks. Michael wrote 4 of them himself, including a song called Billie Jean that he'd been working on for months. The first single from Thriller was The Girl Is Mine, a duet with Paul McCartney that reached number 2 in the United States. It was a good song, pleasant and catchy, but it didn't prepare anyone for what came next. In January 1983, Epic Records released Billie Jean as the second single. The song was different from anything on the radio. It opened with that instantly recognizable bass line, then Michael's voice came in, telling a story about a woman claiming he fathered her child. The production was crisp, modern, electronic. The drums hit hard, and when Michael sang the chorus, it was impossible not to move. Billie Jean started climbing the charts immediately. 2 months after its release, it hit number one. It would stay there for 7 straight weeks. It became Michael's fastest rising number one hit since his Jackson 5 Days, more than a decade earlier. And suddenly, Thriller wasn't just another album, it was becoming a phenomenon. But MTV had a problem. The cable music channel, which had launched just 2 years earlier in 1981, had become incredibly influential. If MTV played your video, you were on your way to stardom. But MTV barely played black artists. The channel's executives claimed they played rock music, and black artists didn't fit their format. Never mind that Michael Jackson's music had rock elements, or that music had never been quite that segregated before. CBS Records president Walter Yetnikoff had heard enough. He called MTV and made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Either they played the Billie Jean video, or CBS would pull every single video from every single artist on their label, and he'd make sure everyone knew exactly why. MTV played Billie Jean. The video went into heavy rotation, and suddenly, millions of people who watched MTV were seeing Michael Jackson spinning, dancing, moving in ways that seemed to defy physics. The channel's decision to play Jackson and later Prince in 1982 and 1983 opened doors for black artists that had been closed. But it was also good business. People wanted to watch Michael Jackson. By March 1983, Billie Jean and the Thriller album were both sitting at number one on the charts both in the United States and the United Kingdom at the same time, something that was rare then and is still impressive now. Michael Jackson was officially the biggest star in music, and that's when Motown came calling. Suzanne DePassy had an idea. She'd been Berry Gordy's right-hand person at Motown for years, and she knew the label was struggling. The glory days of the 1960s felt like ancient history. New labels were dominating. Motown needed something big to remind people of what the label had meant to American music. She pitched Berry Gordy on a 25th anniversary television special. They'd bring back all the biggest Motown stars for one night of nostalgia and celebration. The profits would go to charity. Gordy loved the idea and assumed his former artists would jump at the chance. He was wrong. Diana Ross, who'd been Motown's queen in the 1960s, was living a different life now. She was hanging out with fashion designers, dining at expensive restaurants, and her recent albums for RCA were doing well. When DePass called about Motown 25, Ross declined. But DePass was smart. She went to the press and announced that Diana Ross would be a special guest star. Once fans got excited, Ross couldn't back out without looking bad. She agreed. Stevie Wonder said maybe if he could make it back from his tour of Africa in time. Marvin Gaye said he'd consider it, but only if Berry Gordy asked him personally. Richard Pryor agreed to host, despite his growing personal struggles. And Michael Jackson said no. Michael had complex feelings about television. He'd been performing on TV since he was 10 years old. He'd done countless variety shows, specials, and appearances. And by 1983, with Thriller exploding, Michael felt like he'd been on television too much lately. In his autobiography, he wrote that his whole attitude toward TV was fairly negative. But more than that, Michael was trying to establish himself as a solo artist. The Jackson 5 was his past. Motown was his childhood. He was 24 years old now with the number one album and single in America. Going back to perform with his brothers felt like regression. Like trading on old glories instead of building new ones, Berry Gordy understood Michael better than most people did. He'd known Michael since the kid was 10. He'd seen the drive, the perfectionism, the constant need to evolve. So Gordy went to see Michael personally. He showed up at a studio session where Michael was working. The conversation was private, but people close to both men said Gordy didn't plead or pressure. He just reminded Michael of where it had all started. The Jackson Five had been Motown's breakthrough group for the new decade of the 1970s. They'd helped keep the label relevant, and Michael, who was loyal to people who'd believed in him, started to reconsider. But Michael had a condition. He'd do the Jackson 5 reunion, but only if he could perform solo too, and not a Motown song. He wanted to do Billie Jean. This created an immediate problem for the producers. Motown 25 was supposed to celebrate Motown's 25 years of hits. Every artist performing was supposed to do their classic Motown songs, Suzanne de Pass, and director Don Mischer had already told every single artist on the show, from Marvin Gaye to The Temptations to Diana Ross, that they couldn't perform new material. It was a reunion show, not a showcase for current work. Don Mischer knew what would happen if they made an exception for Michael. He told his team, "Look, if we let Michael do a new song, who's going to take the phone call from Marvin Gaye on Monday saying, 'Why did you let Michael do a new song and I couldn't do a new song?'" It was a legitimate concern. These were massive egos. Legendary artists who'd built Motown playing favorites could blow up the entire show. But then Michael showed them what he was planning. The night before the taping, the Pasadena Civic Auditorium was mostly empty. A few people scattered around the venue. Linda Ronstadt was there, Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross. But it wasn't a full rehearsal with an audience. Michael Jackson took the stage to run through Billie Jean. Nobody knew what to expect. The producers had agreed to let him try it, though they were still nervous about the politics of allowing one artist to break the rules everyone else had to follow. Michael had been secretive about his performance. He'd been practicing in his kitchen at home, working out moves, but he hadn't shown anyone the full routine. The music started. That iconic bass line filled the empty auditorium. Michael began to move. Don Mischer watched from the production booth. He saw the black sequined jacket, the single white glove that caught the light. The way Michael commanded attention, even in an empty room, Michael spun, posed, hit marks with military precision. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed effortless, but Mischer knew came from years of obsessive practice. And then Michael did something that made everyone watching stop what they were doing. He glided backward across the stage, his feet moving in a way that seemed to defy basic physics. It looked like he was walking on ice or on the moon, or like he'd somehow found a way to move through space differently than other human beings. The move lasted only a few seconds. Michael spun around after, landing briefly on his toes, then continuing with the rest of his performance. But those few seconds were enough. When the rehearsal ended, Mischer and DePass looked at each other. They'd just watched something special. They couldn't quite articulate what it was yet, but they knew. They told Michael he could perform Billie Jean on the show. Mischer volunteered to personally take the angry phone call from Marvin Gaye on Monday morning. What they didn't know was that Michael had been even more secretive than they realized. During rehearsals, he'd performed Billie Jean without that backward glide. He'd saved it for the actual taping. Even the people who'd watched him rehearse the night before hadn't seen him do it the way he would. On the night that mattered, Michael had learned the move from street dancers. In 1979, he'd been watching Soul Train, the influential dance show, and saw two dancers named Jerron Casper, candidate, and Derek Cooley Jackson perform to his own song, Working Day and Night. They did a move called the backslide, where they appeared to glide backward across the floor. Michael was mesmerized. He'd also seen Jeffrey Daniel, a dancer from the group Shalimar, perform the backslide on British television in 1982. In 1980, when Shalimar performed at Disneyland, Michael brought his sister Janet to watch from the side of the stage. He couldn't take his eyes off Daniel's movements. Michael's management reached out to Casper and Cooley, arranging for them to come teach Michael the technique. They worked with him for 3 days. Cooley had to leave for another job, but Casper stayed to help Michael perfect the move. Later, after Daniel returned from tour, Michael brought him in to refine the technique even further. The backslide wasn't new. Dancers had been performing versions of it since at least the 1950s. Cab Calloway did something similar in the 1930s. James Brown incorporated it into his performances. But nobody had done it quite like Michael was about to do it. and nobody had done it in front of 50 million people. The taping of Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, Forever, took place on Friday, March 25th, 1983. At that point, Billie Jean had been sitting at number one for nearly 4 weeks. The song was unavoidable. You heard it on the radio, in stores, at parties, everywhere. The Thriller album was on its way to becoming the fastest-selling record in music history. The show itself was exactly what you'd expect from a Motown reunion. Legends who'd defined a generation of music. The Supremes, the Four Tops, the Temptations. Marvin Gaye giving an inspired speech about black music. Smokey Robinson reuniting with the Miracles. The audience at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium was racially diverse, which was unusual for a concert in 1983, with black and white fans in tuxedos and gowns clapping together for music that had brought people together for 25 years. The Jackson Five were the fourth act to perform. Michael walked on stage with his brothers, including Jermaine, who hadn't performed with them in 8 years since he'd stayed with Motown when the others left. They wore matching silver suit jackets, sharp black slacks, and bow ties. They looked like a polished nightclub act from another era. They performed a medley of their greatest hits, I Want You Back, The Love You Save, Never Can Say Goodbye, I'll Be There. The crowd loved it. These were songs that had defined childhoods, that had played on radios across America when the 1970s were just beginning. The choreography was tight, professional, exactly what you'd expect from performers who'd been doing this since they were children. Michael sang lead on most of the songs. His voice had matured, deepened slightly from his child star days, but he still had that distinctive quality that made him instantly recognizable. And even during the reunion performance, you could see he was something different from his brothers. He moved with more precision. He commanded attention in a way that went beyond being the lead singer. When the Jackson 5 medley ended, Michael's brothers walked off stage. Michael stayed. He adjusted his fedora, turned to the crowd, and spoke. The words seemed casual, spontaneous, like he was just sharing a thought with the audience. He told them about the good old days, how those songs brought back memories. He said he liked those songs. But then he added, especially he liked the new songs. It was actually a scripted line written by Motown 25 scriptwriter Buzz Cohan, but it played perfectly. The transition from nostalgia to present day. From the Jackson 5 to Michael Jackson. From yesterday to today. And then the Billie Jean bass line dropped. Michael had planned every detail obsessively. The black pants were cut short to show his white socks and draw attention to his feet. The single white glove sparkled under the lights. The black sequined jacket caught every spotlight. He'd even rehearsed with a stage manager about exactly where his fedora should be placed after the Jackson 5 performance, so he could grab it at the precise right moment for his solo performance. The music played and Michael moved like nobody else on earth. He spun on his toes. He jerked his body with sharp staccato movements. He'd studied James Brown, Fred Astaire, Bob Fosse, Marcel Marceau. He'd taken elements from all of them and created something entirely his own. The audience at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium couldn't take their eyes off him. Michael hiked up his pants, showing those white socks even more clearly. He struck a pose, fists to his face, almost pleading like James Brown used to do. The choreography built and built, each move more impressive than the last. And then, about 2/3 through the performance, during the Billie Jean guitar solo, Michael did it. He spun around, he pulled up his pants legs, he looked forward toward the audience, and he glided backward across the stage, his feet moving in impossible ways, looking like he was walking on the moon or defying gravity or performing actual magic. The move lasted 2.5 seconds, that's it. In the 40 years since that night, those 2.5 seconds have been analyzed, studied, imitated, parodied, and celebrated more than almost any other moment in entertainment history. But in the moment, it was just a brief, stunning illusion that made the audience erupt in screams. A sort of screech came from the crowd according to people who were there. People who'd been sitting down stood up. The camera caught glimpses of the audience, their faces showing genuine shock and delight. Even the people who'd seen some version of the rehearsal were stunned because Michael hadn't done it exactly like this before. Russ Tarana, Motown's veteran chief recording engineer, was outside in the sound truck recording the show. He said Michael never performed the moonwalk during rehearsals, only when he did the show. Only when it counted. Michael spun around after the moonwalk and landed on his toes briefly. Later, he would tell people he regretted not holding that toe stand longer. Even in his moment of triumph, he was critiquing himself, thinking about what could have been better. But the audience didn't care about what could have been better. They'd just witnessed something they'd never seen before. The rest of Michael's performance was just as strong, but the moonwalk was what everyone would remember. The thing that would be written about, talked about, imitated for decades. When the performance ended, the crowd gave Michael a standing ovation backstage. Michael cried. He would later tell Oprah Winfrey in a 1993 interview that he was unhappy with his performance, that he was never satisfied even when people told him something was phenomenal, but in the moment, he'd just done exactly what he'd set out to do. He'd created something unforgettable. The show was taped on March 25th, but it wouldn't air on television for nearly 2 months. During that time, Michael had second thoughts. His attorneys sent a letter to Suzanne de Pass during rehearsals saying they were forbidden to broadcast the Billie Jean performance. Michael wanted to do it for the people in the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, but he didn't want it on television. De Pass went directly to Michael. She told him they'd tape it and he could come to the editing room and watch it. If he didn't like what he saw, they wouldn't use it. It was the right approach. Michael came to the editing room, watched his performance, and loved it. He gave them permission to air it. On May 16, 1983, Motown 25. Yesterday, Today, forever premiered on NBC. 50 million people tuned in. That's 35% of all television owners in the United States. On that Monday night, the show dominated American culture. The next day, strangers talked about it everywhere. On street corners, in subway stations, at offices, everyone was raving about something: the coolness of Marvin Gaye, the suaveness of Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross's finale. But mostly, everyone was screaming about the moonwalk. Don Misher, the show's director, was in Washington 2 days after the broadcast to film an interview with First Lady Nancy Reagan. Coming down the elevator in his hotel, everybody was talking about Michael. In the taxi to the White House, everybody was talking about Michael. In the East Wing of the White House, everybody was talking about Motown 25. And Michael Misher realized that morning that the show had an incredible impact. They'd created one of those rare moments where an entire nation shares the same cultural experience. At the same time, Michael Jackson sent Misher a signed photo after the show aired. It said, "Thanks for the magic moment." That magic moment changed everything. Sales of Thriller, which had already been massive, exploded. The album started selling 1 million copies per week. People who'd never bought a Michael Jackson album suddenly needed to own Thriller. By 1984, the album had sold 32 million copies worldwide, making it the biggest-selling album of all time. It would eventually be certified 33 times platinum in the United States alone, with estimates of 67 to 100 million copies sold globally. Fred Astaire, the legendary dancer who'd set the standard for grace and movement in film, called Michael to congratulate him. Sammy Davis Jr. reached out to say how much he loved the performance. In September 1983, Michael received an Emmy nomination for his show-stopping routine. The Thriller album won 8 Grammy Awards in 1984, a record. Michael became a fixture on MTV. He met President Ronald Reagan at the White House. An intense fan phenomenon known as Michael Mania swept across the world. Michael Jackson wasn't just famous anymore, he was the biggest entertainer on the planet. But perhaps the most significant impact was what the moonwalk meant for dance itself. Suddenly, kids everywhere were trying to learn how to do it. Dance crews formed. People practiced on cardboard in parking lots and on street corners. The move became a symbol of cool, of being able to do something impossible. Music videos, which had been considered promotional tools before, suddenly became an art form. If Michael could do that in 2.5 seconds during a TV performance, what could he do in a full-length video? The answer came later that year when Michael released the Thriller video, a 14-minute short film directed by John Landis that premiered on MTV on December 2nd, 1983. It wasn't just a music video, it was a cultural event. It had a plot, professional actors, zombie choreography that became as iconic as the moonwalk itself. The video cost $500,000 to make, an insane amount for a music video at the time. But it was worth it. The Thriller video was watched by millions, discussed endlessly, and essentially transformed what a music video could be. And Michael Jackson continued to perform Billie Jean hundreds of times during all his tours and television appearances. He kept the same routine he debuted at Motown 25, though he refined it, perfecting that toe stand he'd regretted not holding longer. Every single time audiences screamed during the moonwalk, it never got old for them. For Michael, it probably never felt quite good enough. Michael Jackson never claimed to invent the moonwalk, though he certainly made it famous. In his autobiography, titled appropriately enough Moonwalk, he referred to the move as a breakdance step, a popping type of thing that kids had created dancing on street corners. He acknowledged his influences, though he didn't always give specific credit to the people who taught him. Cooley Jackson, one of the dancers who worked with Michael before Motown 25, later expressed frustration about this. He and Casper had spent years developing and perfecting the backslide. They'd performed it on Soul Train and in clubs. And then Michael did it once on television, and suddenly everyone thought Michael invented it. Cooley said they kind of ended up being invisible, but they never complained publicly about it. Jeffrey Daniel, who would later work with Michael as co-choreographer on the Bad and Smooth Criminal videos, was more philosophical about it. He gave credit to dancers who came before him, to Don Campbell of the Lockers, to Cleveland Moses Jr., to Tyrone Proctor. The dance had evolved over decades, passed from one generation to the next, each dancer adding their own style. What Michael did was bring it to the mainstream. He took a move from street dancers, from black dance culture, and put it on network television in front of 50 million people. He made it accessible, aspirational, iconic. And in doing so, he brought attention to a whole style of dance that had been thriving in urban communities but hadn't gotten national recognition. The name Moonwalk itself was Michael's creation, or at least his publicists'. The street dancers called it the backslide. But Moonwalk captured something about the illusion, the sense that Michael was moving differently than normal humans, walking on a surface with less gravity. It was a perfect name for a perfect moment. After Motown 25, Michael Jackson had achieved something most artists only dream about. He was, by any measure, the biggest star in the world. He had the best-selling album of all time. He'd created the most iconic dance move in pop culture. He could do anything he wanted. But Michael Jackson was never satisfied. That drive that had pushed him since childhood, that constant need to improve and evolve, didn't disappear just because he'd reached the top. If anything, it intensified. Now he had to maintain it. He had to prove that Thriller wasn't a fluke, that the moonwalk wasn't his only trick. The pressure was enormous. When you're the biggest star in the world, everyone is watching for you to fail. Every move is scrutinized. Every decision is questioned. And Michael, who'd been performing since he was 5 years old, had spent his entire life in that spotlight. He'd never had a normal childhood. He'd never had privacy. He'd never had the luxury of making mistakes without the world knowing about it. People close to Michael said he became increasingly isolated after Thriller fame on that level is hard to comprehend unless you've lived it. You can't go anywhere without being mobbed. You can't trust people's motives because everyone wants something from you. You start to question whether people like you for who you are or for what you represent. Michael threw himself into his work. He spent years preparing his next album, Bad, which came out in 1987. It was a massive success, though it couldn't quite match Thriller's numbers because nothing could match Thriller. He continued to innovate with music videos, creating elaborate productions that pushed boundaries. He went on a world tour that became legendary for its production value and Michael's physical performances that seemed to defy human endurance. But he also made choices that seemed increasingly strange to the public. The plastic surgery, the changing appearance, the behavior that seemed odd or childlike, the spending that seemed out of control, the controversies that would dog him for the rest of his life. It's impossible to separate Michael Jackson the performer from Michael Jackson the person, and both were shaped by that night at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium in ways both wonderful and terrible. The moonwalk gave him everything he'd ever wanted, and it trapped him in a level of fame that few humans could handle. More than 40 years after Michael Jackson moonwalked for the first time on national television, that moment remains one of the most recognizable and celebrated performances in entertainment history. It's been named one of the greatest television moments of all time. It's been parodied countless times. It's been referenced in movies, television shows, commercials, and by performers from every genre of music. But what made it so powerful wasn't just the technical skill, though that was impressive. It was the moment itself. Michael Jackson was 24 years old at the peak of his physical abilities, performing for an audience that included his childhood heroes and 50 million people watching at home. He'd been told no by the producers initially. His own team had tried to stop him from broadcasting it, but he trusted his instincts, practiced obsessively, and delivered something that nobody had seen before. The moonwalk represented everything Michael Jackson was about as a performer. The perfectionism, the showmanship, the willingness to take risks, the ability to take something from the street culture and elevate it to art. The understanding that entertainment isn't just about being good, it's about creating moments that people will never forget. And in 2.5 seconds moving backward across the stage in Pasadena, Michael Jackson created one of those moments. The managers who initially laughed or doubted weren't laughing anymore. The producers who almost didn't let him perform Billie Jean knew they'd witnessed history. And 50 million people watching at home, not knowing they were about to see something that would be talked about for generations, got to be part of the magic. That's the real story of the moonwalk. Not just a dance move, but a moment when talent, preparation, opportunity, and pure determination came together perfectly. When a kid from Gary, Indiana, who'd been performing since he was 5 years old, proved that he wasn't just a child star or a nostalgia act, he was Michael Jackson, and the world would never forget it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.